Welcome to The Explainer. So India's constitution makes this incredible promise of equality to every single citizen. But for millions of people, that promise, well, it hasn't quite been fulfilled. Today, we're going to dive right into that gap between the ideal and the reality of what we call marginalization. We'll look at who is affected, what the law actually says, and why this is one of India's most critical and, ongoing challenges.
You know, the entire foundation of modern India was really built on the vision of leaders like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. He was a true champion for the oppressed, and he fought tooth and nail for what he called special safeguards, ideas that would become absolutely crucial. He knew it wasn't just about political freedom. It was about building a society based on social justice, and that vision, that's our starting point today.
But what happens when that amazing promise, that foundational vision, bumps up against the messy, complex, and deeply rooted realities of society? Well, that's where we run into this concept of marginalization. It's really that persistent, stubborn gap between the ideal on paper and the actual lived experience of millions of people.
So what is marginalization, really? It's so much more than just being poor. It's a whole social process of being pushed to the edges, to the fringes. It means being systematically denied access, not just to money or resources, but to power, to opportunity, to having a voice in the mainstream of the nation. It's an exclusion that works on every level: social, economic, and cultural.
Okay, so let's look at who we're talking about. First up, the Adivasis, often called India's original inhabitants. Their entire way of life, which is so deeply connected to the forests, has been completely turned upside down. As things like development, mining, and new forest policies expand, they often get evicted from the lands their ancestors have lived on for generations. And where do they go? Many are forced into cities, into low-wage labor, losing not just their homes, but a core part of their identity.
Then we have the Dalits, who the Constitution officially calls scheduled castes. For centuries, they were subjected to the brutal practice of untouchability. Now, even though that practice is outlawed, they still face this deeply entrenched social discrimination, violence, and are often pushed into the most hazardous and, frankly, dehumanizing jobs in society.
Marginalization also hits religious minorities. India's largest minority, the Muslim community, often has to deal with prejudice that leads to very real discrimination, things like being denied housing or jobs. This can create social isolation, a kind of ghettoization, and it has a real, measurable impact. I mean, look at the data on education. Muslim girls actually have some of the lowest school completion rates in the country.
And, cutting across all of these communities, women face their own unique forms of marginalization. There's this rigid division of labor where their immense contributions in the home go unpaid and completely unrecognized. You can see this inequality plain as day in the data. Just look at that literacy gap. And it gets even worse for girls from Dalit and Adivasi backgrounds. They face a sort of double whammy and have the highest school dropout rates of all.
Now check this out. This is where you see how all that social exclusion translates into cold, hard economic facts. This chart shows the percentage of people living below the poverty line. So the national average is about 27%, but for scheduled castes, it jumps to 34%, and for scheduled tribes, a staggering 43%. That is not a coincidence. That's the economic result of systemic marginalization.
So, this all begs a huge question, right? What is the system actually supposed to do about all this? And that brings us to the constitutional safeguards, the legal tools that were specifically designed to fight for justice and equality.
Right at the very heart of the Indian Constitution, you'll find the guarantee of fundamental rights. And the big one, for our purposes, is the right to equality. This isn't just a nice idea or a suggestion. It's a legally binding promise. It's a right that's guaranteed to every single citizen.
And within that, these two articles are absolute game changers. Think of Article 15 as a shield. It's this broad protection against being discriminated against for who you are. But Article 17, that's the hammer. It doesn't just prevent untouchability, it abolishes it, making it a crime you can be punished for. This was the law of the land directly taking on a social hierarchy that had existed for centuries.
And building on that constitutional foundation, you have specific laws like the Atrocities Act. This law is so important because it gets really specific. It's not just a general ban. It actually lists out these horrific acts of humiliation and violence. It also protects land and resources, and, this is crucial, it has specific safeguards for Dalit and Adivasi women because it recognizes they are uniquely vulnerable.
And finally, of course, there's the reservation policy. This is a mechanism that's designed to actively correct for centuries of disadvantage.
The whole idea is that by reserving seats in colleges and government jobs, you're trying to guarantee access to opportunities that were systematically denied, basically trying to level the playing field.
Okay, so we've got the constitutional promise, and we have these specific laws. But the real test, the real struggle, is turning those words in a law book into a lived reality for people. So now, let's look at how this fight for rights actually plays out on the ground.
This is a postcard that was sent from a Dalit community in Odisha, and it's just a harrowing account. Basically, some educated young men in the community refused to perform a humiliating ritual, and the backlash, it was swift, and it was brutal, and it was targeted directly at the women of the community. This isn't just a story, it's a raw, painful example of the violent resistance that can erupt when marginalized people just begin to assert their basic human dignity.
Let's be absolutely crystal clear about what something like this represents. What happened in that village isn't just a local crime. It is a direct, flagrant violation of the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution. It's a violation of the right to equality and, maybe most importantly, a violation of the fundamental right to dignity.
Another really critical battleground has been the fight to end manual scavenging. This is a practice where people, almost always from Dalit communities, are forced to clean dry latrines by hand. It's an absolutely subhuman, incredibly dangerous job, and it's a stark living symbol of how untouchability persists, even though it's illegal.
And get this, despite being banned, activists estimate that around 100,000 people are still trapped in this profession. Just let that number sink in. That's 100,000 individuals who are denied their fundamental right to a dignified life, forced into a practice that was born out of caste hierarchy.
Now, the fight against it has been long and hard. A law was passed way back in 1993, but it was pretty much ineffective. It actually took activists a decade to force the issue by taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. That pressure finally led to a much stronger law in 2013 that didn't just ban the practice, but focused on rehabilitating the workers. It's an amazing testament to the power of activism and making sure constitutional rights are actually enforced.
You know, these stories of both brutal resistance and incredible activism, they all lead us to our final point. This is an unfinished struggle. It's crystal clear that while India has this strong legal framework, the path to true, meaningful equality is far, far from complete.
This cartoon just brilliantly captures the social dynamic at play here. It shows that from the perspective of groups that have always been dominant, policies like reservations can feel like the world is being turned upside down. The push for equality is often seen as a disruption to the way things have always been, which explains so much of the resistance we see.
So, at the end of the day, we're left with this fundamental tension. On one side, you have the nation's profound constitutional promise, a society built on justice and equality for all. And on the other side, you have the stark reality of a daily, ongoing struggle against prejudice and inequality that's baked into the system.
And that brings us to what might be the most crucial point of all. This fight for social justice can't just be the burden of marginalized communities to fight alone. It is an ongoing test for the entire nation. It's a measure of how truly committed India is to its own founding ideals of equality and justice for every single person.
And that leaves us with a final, really complex question to think about. How does any society navigate this journey? How do you balance the absolute need for special protections and policies right now with that ultimate dream of building a truly equal society where one day those safeguards just aren't necessary anymore? That remains the central challenge.